Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We are very pleased to be joined today by Maximo Torero. As you know, he's the Chief Economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization. He will brief you from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil on the report State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2024. Mr. Torero, welcome. You have the floor, please.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay,
thanks.
perfect. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. As you know, today in the G20 of Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, we launched with the other 4 agencies, the UN agencies, FAO, WFP, UNICEF, IFAD, and WHO, the SOFI report for 2024. Latest estimates show that global hunger is persistently high, in nearly at the same level of the last 3 consecutive years. This is after having risen sharply following the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are staying at the high levels of COVID pandemic. Around 9.1% of the global population faced hunger in 2023, 733 million, compared to 7.5% in 2019. This means that the current levels of undernourishment are comparable to those of 2008 and 2009, meaning that we have lost around 15 years of progress. If we consider the broader goal of ensuring regular access to adequate food, this is also stalled, and the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity has remained unchanged for the last 3 years at around 28.9%, which is 22.33 billion people. The bottom line is that we are still far from off track towards the goal of freeing the world of hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition by 2030. And based on the current trajectory, that will put us by 2030 with the current conditions in 582 million people, which will still be facing hunger by 2030. And almost half of those will come from Africa. However, what the report also shows is that there are differences within the global number. And these regional differences are really impactful. On one side, we have South America, which have improved substantially. They have reduced in the last 2 years 5.4 million people less in hunger. We have Southern Asia, which is also progressing, but we have Africa, which is significantly deteriorating over time. Africa is the region with the largest percentage of population facing hunger, more than 20%, and the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity is 58%, was nearly double the global average. Now, what these differences bring to us is that we can learn from the regions that are doing better, and we can try to extrapolate those to the regions that are not really moving at a velocity, even in the correct direction. The report also looks at one of the measures, the indicators that now we report annually, which is the cost of access to healthy diets. And the report shows that there is 2.83 billion people that are unable to afford a healthy diet in 2022. This was larger. This also shows that if you look at the trend, there is an improvement in the access to healthy diets relative to previous years. But the reason of this is because there is an offset of the income side because of countries growing more relative to the increase in the prices and the cost of the healthy diets. The sad part of it is that this is mostly happening in high-income countries and high-middle-income countries. Is not happening in the poorest countries, where in 2022, 1.68 billion people were unable to afford healthy diets, 59%, which live in lower middle-income countries. Now, the second part of the report is focusing on one of the major challenges, which is how we resolve this and how we look into the financing mechanisms. And the first thing that the report brings up is the complexity of the different definitions that we have already today in place, where basically we don't know what is really funding moving out of poverty or the SDG2 indicators. So the report tries to bring a definition that will include the core elements of both the definition of food security and nutrition, so access, availability, stability, etc., and also the health component, which is central to assure that what we eat also it gets the benefits that it should be. But it also adds to that definition, trying to look at funding to cope with the major drivers that we are observing today. And those are conflict, climate variability, slowdowns and downturns, access to healthy diets, and income inequality. So this new definition will help us to really understand where the money is going and where there are gaps of those money. Why is this so important? Because if we look at today, we can range, for example, on ODA between $6.9 to $62.6 billion, depending on the definition we use. So it's very important an FAO as a normative agency to have a common definition over which we can track and see the progress. In this topic also, the report comes up with a very strong 3 recommendations which we believe are important. And why they are important? Because we observe that countries with the highest level of food insecurity are oftentimes with less access to financing. Of the 119 low and middle income countries analyzed, around 63% have limited or moderately ability to access to financing. So what we can do to change this pattern and what we can do to improve this? There are 3 recommendations. First is to enhance coordination. We really have a coordination failure. There has been marginal improvements, but we need significant improvements on coordination and consensus on what and where it is essential to finance and better target financing. And this, of course, is also linked to the definition. Second, donors and other international actors must be more risk tolerant and involved in the risking activities. The appetite for risk of the donors has to increase. And this is natural because the agri-food system, which is the major contributor to food and the major contributor to reducing hunger and poverty in the world, is under risk and uncertainties. Just climate variability is a risk and uncertainty, conflict. So donors have to take more appetite of risk to be able to comply with these needs. And finally, we need to innovate more in financing. Blending finance is a way to attract private finance, but also we need to attract climate finance to the agri-food system transformation. The agri-food system provides the right to food, provides the food for people. It also creates externalities. It creates externalities on environment through emissions, on biodiversity, on water use, on the nature in general. But it's the sector that has the most capacity of improving efficiencies. And therefore, climate financing should be linked to the agri-food system. Today, only 3% of climate financing comes to the agri-food systems, and that has to change. Now, the question is why we are launching this in the G20 of Brazil. And the answer is simple. It's because the G20 of Brazil is moving forward the alliance, the global alliance against hunger and poverty. And we believe that the alliance, which has 3 key pillars, knowledge, financing, and country action, are central on what the SOFI report is telling us today. The financing part, as I told you, the knowledge of the regions that have improved better than others, and of course the action at the country level. We also believe that the SOFI is a baseline today of where we are in all the indicators of food security and nutrition and hunger, so that we can track over the next 6 years if the alliance really can make an impact by improving coordination and improving sharing of knowledge of the best practices in the world in areas that we know things work, like social protection, school feeding programs, and nutrition interventions, and many others. So with that, let me stop there. I'm more than happy to answer any question you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Torero. We can now open the floor for questions. Edie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Torero. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of questions. First, we've seen in almost every UN humanitarian appeal a very serious shortage of funding. You just talked about financing to alleviate this growing gap and improve food distribution quality. What big an impact or how big an impact are you seeing on the funding issue? And do you see this as donor fatigue? Do you see this as funds going to Gaza, Ukraine, other conflicts? Thank you.
No, thank you very much for your question. And let me differentiate 2 things. The report that we presented today is about hunger and chronic undernourishment and nutrition indicators, of course. What you are referring is more to acute food insecurity, which is short-term and is a response to emergencies. And that is where we are seeing significant gaps of investment. Why? Because the level of conflicts has increased enormously. You see what is happening in Gaza, what is happening now in Sudan, and in other parts of the world, and we do the report of the food crisis together with WFP on this. Now, the point for us is that right now we are observing that donors and big donors are shrinking their support to this type of activities. And agencies, humanitarian agencies, are facing significant challenges. And it's because there has been a significant intensity over investment over time. Now, one of the arguments which is important in this topic is, okay, how much are we doing today of not just immediate delivery because of an emergency, so short-term delivery, but how much are we doing of anticipatory action and early action? Why? Because we know with anticipatory action, we will earn per dollar, $5. $1 invested, $5 earning. And in early action, we can earn from $1 to $3. So $1 investment, $3 of return. And that's something that we are working with all the humanitarian agencies to try to figure a way in which we can accelerate that, which is a complex issue because you basically, for anticipatory action, you need to predict when this event could happen. So you don't need to wait for the event to happen. For early action, you respond quickly when the event has happened. But I think that could help enormously to gain efficiencies in terms we use the resources, but that doesn't move away us from the increased needs that we are facing in these countries. But anticipatory action could be essential to tackle the structural programs that this report is also trying to tackle, because this report in the financing recommendation is saying, let's expand the definition to the key drivers of food insecurity, of acute food insecurity in these times, which is conflict, climate, slowdowns, and downturns. And that could help us to move both in the short term through direct assistance to in the medium term and start to build anticipatory action plans that will help to tackle the structural problems.
Thank you very much, Deji. Please.
Hi, Mr. Torero. This is Deji Xu with China Central Television. We saw this report. There are over 71 million people who are facing hunger in 2023, which is more than in the numbers in 2019. I'm curious if we're talking about food production, how is the food production quantity affect this number? I mean, where is the difficulties? Is this because of the production, accessibility, or delivery?
No, very, very good question. And first of all, if we look at calories, the world produces the calories we need. So if we're just going to feed people with calories, and we resolve the problem of redistribution, meaning income, then of course we have enough food production for calories in the world. Now, calories is not enough, of course, because that won't resolve the problem of undernourishment consistently and the problem of overnutrition. That's where we look at cost of access to healthy diets. So that means including other types of food so that we have the diversity of the diet and bring in vegetables, fruits and vegetables, and other types of elements like fish, livestock, and other things that are needed in the areas which are poor. Right now, we still have a gap on the production of those high-value commodities, which, of course, has to change, and that's why we need to do the transformation of the agri-food system so that the incentives are moved towards commodities that will reduce the cost of access to healthy diets. So there is a lot to do on the supply side, too, if we move farther from calories. Second, even if we focus on calories only, there is a high concentration of the supply. So very few countries produce the cereals in the world, and we have seen that in all the years. 4 or 5 are the top producers of wheat, of maize, soybeans, and corn. And therefore, anything that happens in these countries will exacerbate prices. Today, we are in a stable situation in terms of supply of cereals, but because of this concentration, if something happens with climate, that could impact, of course, these people, these countries which are key exporters. So again, we also need to increase the big producers of cereals in the world so that we diversify more our portfolio, which is basically being more resilient to this potential risk of climate that we will be facing in the future.
Thank you very much. Do we have any, Edie?
Since you just alluded to this, how serious has the impact of the war in Ukraine, where you have 2 major cereal suppliers, Russia and Ukraine, that their crops have been affected?
So at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, because they were a key exporter of cereals, as you know, both Ukraine and Russian Federation, there was a significant impact over prices, which were already in high levels. So it basically exacerbated even more the situation of prices. that was at the beginning of the war. As things have evolved with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, things smooth out, and Ukraine was able to push out most of their grain and therefore stabilize. But of course, there are areas that has been affected by the war, and that has made that Ukraine today is not like one of the top key exporters as it was before. So that has helped to concentrate even more the market and return to levels of concentration that we had even during the 2007-2008 food crisis. Now, what was the impact of the war in Ukraine? In the last SOFI, not in this one, but in the previous SOFI, we measured that, and we measured what was the impact of what happened in Ukraine by 2030. And the impact was not so significant. It was around 19 million people being moved into hunger because of the Ukraine war. Where the bigger impact has happened is in the case of COVID-19. COVID-19 has had an impact of more than 100 million people moving into hunger because of COVID-19. That's where the biggest impact has been. But the war in Ukraine had an impact, and it had an impact, of course, on prices in that period of time, and now prices of commodities are starting to smooth out. But another dimension of the war in Ukraine that is important to understand is that the North African countries had a problem immediately because of the closure of the Black Sea. And that shows us that unless we have more resilience, meaning more diversity of traders and more diversity of what we produce in our countries, we won't be able to cope with this situation. That's what happened in the first 6 months for these countries in the war in Ukraine. And finally, the war in Ukraine also affected the input markets, affected the fertilizer market especially. And that made the fertilizer prices increase substantially during that period, even 4 times more. Now, luckily, we have resolved that problem. There is enough fertilizers in the world, and we are facing a better situation in terms of prices of inputs.
I wonder if you could address one other issue that's been raised all over the world, and that is inflation and the high cost of food. Is there any prospect of food prices coming down?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. And here is where it's important to differentiate 2 things. One is the commodity prices, that is the price of maize, wheat, rice, corn, that we produce as the FAO food price index. Those are raw commodity prices. The other thing is the price of the final commodities, the final products that we eat, what we buy in our local markets, on the supermarkets. Those commodities have, of course, a component of the commodity, like in the case of bread, they have a component of wheat, but they also have other elements like energy use, water, and so on and so forth. So the core commodity is a small percentage of the whole cost of the production. Now, what we have observed is that although the commodity prices, the ones that we report as FAO price index, have been falling over time, the food prices at the end of the market have not fallen at that velocity, even in many cases have remained high. Where it has been improved is in high-income countries. We already are seeing a change in the pattern and reduction of the final food prices, but we are not observing that. But we are not observing that yet in poor countries where the markets are more complex, and still we see that downward trend of the commodity prices is not yet reflected in the final food prices. Now, as I said, in this report, when we look at the cost of healthy diets, we're exactly looking at that because we're looking at the commodities that compose this basket of minimum cost healthy diets. And what we observe is that although the prices of the cost of healthy diets have continued to increase over time, it has been compensated in high-income countries with the income effect because the income has grown because of economic growth. But in the poor countries, that is not happening at all. And the cost of healthy diets keeps increasing. And we hope this will smooth over time, but it will depend that the market continues to be stable and we don't face a shock that could affect production.
Thank you very much, Mr. Torero. Do we have any further questions? If not, I would like to thank our guests today. Mr. Torero, thank you very much for your time. And please don't go anywhere. Stefan Jarric is already here. He's going to brief you very shortly. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Torero.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.